I've got 3 things I'd like to follow up on with regard to the New King James Version and my recent videos on this excellent translation. I'm going to have to walk back one part of one argument that I made. Walking stuff back is not a fun pastime for me, but letting an error stand would be worse. Never fear, however, the Empire strikes back in this video. I'm going to take a slight step backwards only in order to set my feet for a hard hit. Stick around to the end of the video if you are ready for this. In my recent video, Is the New King James Truly Based on the Textus Receptus? I showed that, yes, definitely. The New King James Version is based on the TR. The New King James contains the 3 major passages that King James onlyists are constantly pointing out as quote-unquote omitted from critical text Bibles. It contains second-tier passages too that get mentioned in the King James debate as being omitted from critical text Bibles. I also did random soundings and looked at 10 passages to see if the New King James followed the TR or the critical text. In every case, the New King James followed the TR clearly and without fail. And yet, at the end of the video, I acknowledge that there are 6 minor obscure places I'm aware of, they've been brought to my attention, where the New King James at least seems to follow a text different than the TR. I divided these into 2 categories, 3 each. There are 3 places I know of where the New King James seems to follow the critical text. I covered those in the previous video. All 3 are incredibly minor and obscure, and not one changes the meaning of the sentence in which it's found. 2, there are 3 places I know of where the New King James does not follow the specific edition of the TR used by King James onlyists, namely Scrivener's 1881 edition, but it matches readings in other TR editions. For example, 2 Corinthians 3:14 reads this way in the King James Version, "But their minds were blinded, for until this day remaineth the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ." It reads this way in the New King James, "But their minds were blinded, for until this day the same veil remains unlifted in the reading of the Old Testament, because the veil is taken away in Christ." That "because" instead of "which" matches the reading in another TR edition. It's possible that for some reason that the New King James translators don't mention, they reached for that edition instead of the Scrivener edition there. In my video, I pointed out that the New King James preface does not promise to use only Scrivener, and I wasn't wrong. But a leader in King James onlyism pointed me to a New King James appendix that I had overlooked, and here's what it said. While the New Testament scholars were free to consult any available Greek text, and they did so, each agreed to follow the Greek text developed by Dr. F.H.A. Scrivener. This text, originally published by Cambridge University Press, reconstructed as closely as possible the Greek text underlying the King James Version. The reasons for the selection of this text were 4-fold. I'll just read the first one, though. Number 1, to have followed a text other than this would have been to produce something other than a King James Bible. So I was wrong. The New King James translators did claim to use Scrivener's TR specifically. In 6 places I'm aware of, the New King James translators did not use the base text that they said they were using, or at least it sure seems that way. So do I have to take it all back? Do I have to stop recommending the New King James to people who prefer the TR? Do these 6 places, and I have to admit, there could be more, do they justify leading King James onlyists in saying the New King James is based on the TR, except when it's not? No. I'm going to play a little defense for a second, but then go on offense in a way that I've not really been eager to do, but have been forced to do by the twists and turns of internet debate. Once again, I encourage you to stick around to the end. First, some quick defense. In my earlier video, I said that I think human finiteness is a better explanation than anything else for these 6 obscure places that don't mean anything different than what the King James said. I still think this, but I explained it sufficiently in the other video, so now my team has the ball and it's on to offense. Here's my first play from scrimmage, first down. The very fact that I can cite other TR editions that contain critical text readings kind of shoots down the story that most mainstream King James onlyists tell. Let's just remember that their viewpoint, as believed and repeated by most of them in my experience, is that there is one TR, and it is jot and tittle perfect. So even to point out that the New King James happens to match another TR than the King James matches, admittedly also in obscure ways, is to raise a subject I find they rarely wish to discuss in any detail. I don't know that this play got me more than a few yards, depending on who exactly is playing defensive line right now, so let's move to second down. Here's my second offensive play. If King James defenders are going to insist on letter-perfect accuracy in text and translation, they're going to have to be subject to the same scrutiny. To put this in biblical terms, I feel I'm constantly pleading for the use of just weights in the King James only controversy. So here's the question. Does the King James itself perfectly match its own Hebrew and Greek base texts? The answer is a clear and definite no, if one insists on perfection, rather than using the standard that the King James translators give in their excellent preface, namely calling something by its predominant characteristics. By its predominant characteristics, the King James is indeed based on the Masoretic Hebrew text and the Textus Receptus Greek New Testament. But if perfection in text and translation is the standard, then I can show places where the King James does not follow any text we know of. I can show places where it follows the Latin Vulgate or Greek Septuagint over the Hebrew in the Old Testament, or where it follows the Vulgate over the Greek of the New. I don't like doing this, to be honest. These are very difficult and treacherous waters. I do not want to upset the faith of any. It can be a little disconcerting to find out what goes into the hot dog. When I do this, I like to do what I can to build a bridge to my hearers through people we both trust. Then we can eat the hot dogs together in faith, hope, and love. And today, the mutually trusted person is F.H.A. Scrivener. Scrivener is the 19th century scholar who put together the edition of the Greek New Testament that's used consistently all throughout King James-only institutions. He produced that edition to match the King James Version. That's why it's used in King James-only institutions that teach Greek. As an essential part of that work, Scrivener looked carefully at the King James Version New Testament and at the source text that the King James translators had available to them. Let me give an example that Scrivener himself gives. This is a famous one. In Revelation 16:5, the great majority of all Greek New Testament manuscripts that we found contains wording that goes like this: "You are righteous, O Lord, who is and was the Holy One." The King James reads, however, "Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be." No Greek text we've ever found reads like the King James, saying "shall be" instead of the Holy One. Just weights for King James onlyists would cause them to assume that the King James translators were trying to diminish or undermine the Bible's teaching about the holiness of God. More important for my argument here, however, just weights would cause them to acknowledge that they are willing to ignore not just the majority of Greek manuscripts, but literally all of them. For the reading in the King James at Revelation 16:5 comes from Theodore Beza in his 1598 Greek text. It's what's called a conjectural emendation, a guess, based on zero evidence. Scrivener came along to Revelation 16:5, and he noticed that the King James did not say Holy One, so he knew that the King James translators did not translate the Stephanus 1550 text here, for example. They translated Beza 1598. Indeed, however, Beza has that reading, so Scrivener put it in his Greek New Testament, the job of which was to reconstruct a TR edition that records the text-critical decisions of the King James translators, even if Scrivener felt those decisions were wrong, as he sometimes did. Overall, here's what Scrivener found: 111 passages in which the King James translators agreed with Beza's 1598 edition of the Greek against Stephanus' 1550 edition of the Greek, which was their other major text. That's Revelation 16:5. That's what they did there. Scrivener found 59 passages in which they did the opposite. And he found 67 passages in which they differed from both and went with an edition of Erasmus or Collinnaeus or the Complutensian Polyglot or something else. Like what else? This is where I'm headed in my long-developing triple-double reverse flea-flicker lateral play. Scrivener tells us what other texts the King James translators used at the end of Appendix E of a very detailed book he wrote about the King James text. He says, "It may be useful to subjoin a list, probably quite an incomplete one, of places in which the translators of 1611 have apparently followed the Latin Vulgate, mostly after the example of Tyndale, sometimes of versions later than his, especially of the Rhemish of 1582, that's the Catholic translation of the Bible, whereof the epistle of the translators to the reader speaks so contemptuously," which is true. It is probable that at least some of the passages collected in the first section of the present appendix, that's Appendix E that we're looking at, wherein the text of the authorized version is supported by the Complutensian Polyglot and the Latin Vulgate only, were derived from the Vulgate rather than from the Complutensian. In other words, they followed the Latin rather than the Greek. In 1 Corinthians 14:10 and 1 John 1:5, where Collinnaeus and the Vulgate alone favor the rendering of 1611, the Vulgate is almost certainly their authority, not Collinnaeus. Did you catch all that? I'll take you through a few of his examples to help you. Here are two examples that Scrivener gives. In Matthew 12:24 and 27, Mark 3:22, Luke 11:15, 18, 19, the King James uses the spelling Beelzebub, even though almost all Greek manuscripts in existence say Beelzebul and not Beelzebub, and actually none say Beelzebub. The TR and the critical text both say Bool, not Bub. So why did the King James translators spell it Beelzebub? Scrivener thinks they got this spelling from Tyndale, who got it from the Latin Vulgate, which says Beelzebub. I think this too, because it is very clearly the Latin Vulgate that has this spelling. And let's remember, the Bible of Tyndale's life was not the King James, not even the Tyndale Bible. It was the Latin Vulgate. That's what he would have read most before he got into the Greek New Testament. So here's a place where Scrivener himself, editor of the TR text used in King James only institutions, shows that the King James is not based on the TR. And if you can read Greek, notice something important. Scrivener did not use the bub spelling in his Greek text because there are no Greek manuscripts or even editions with that spelling. So though this is a relatively minor thing, Scrivener's Greek New Testament does not match the King James here. If we're going by strict letter-for-letter perfection in translation, the King James fails here. Thankfully, I don't think we have to do that, but King James only is should if they're going to be consistent. Now get this for the second example. If you've followed any of this discussion, in the very verse, Luke 1:35, in which King James defenders feel that they've caught the New King James making an error and omitting words omitted by the critical text, Scrivener believes that the King James translators followed Tyndale in following the Latin Vulgate rather than the Greek. The Vulgate makes the main verb of the clause future, the child that will be born to you. And that's what the King James has. But the Greek has a present verb in any edition you check, the child that is born to you. The King James translators did not practice the kind of letter-perfect accuracy in translation that is consistently demanded by King James onlyists. I'm not saying the King James translators committed errors in these places. We'll talk about this a little more later. I'm not saying that they did anything wrong on purpose, surely. I think instead that they acted just as they said they would act in their preface. They acted as humans who have foibles and limitations and who commit little oversights, who don't act with perfect consistency. It's only Spirit-inspired writers who produce perfect work. If that didn't get me a first down, I'm not sure what will, but for my third down offensive play, I want to again appeal to the King James translators, but I'm going to do that at the end of the play, not the beginning. Just today, as I write, I got an email from a pastor who graduated from a King James only college and, as best I know, still prefers the Texas Receptus. He's run into some struggles with his hometown crowd because he has tried to use an easier-to-read TR-based translation in his urban ministry. But this is a guy who does his homework, and he sent me 3 lengthy lists of passages where kind of problems occur in the King James. One of them is a list in which the King James goes with the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, rather than with the Hebrew. I have seen passages like this, but I've never collected them like he did. One such place is the famous coat of many colors in Genesis 37:3. The Hebrew does not say coat of many colors. What it says is uncertain, admittedly. Something that the King James translators acknowledge in their preface can happen in Hebrew. But coat of many colors comes from the Greek Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate, not the Hebrew. Another famous place where the King James clearly departs from the Masoretic Hebrew text is Ruth 3:15. The context practically demands that the final phrase refer to Ruth. After her climactic encounter with Boaz, where she asks him to be her kinsman redeemer, the King James says, she went into the city. But the Hebrew does not say this. It says he went into the city, referring to Boaz. Some editions of the 1611 King James actually did stick with the Hebrew. The one I frequently use at King James Bible Online did this. You can see it in this photograph here. But modern editions of the King James do not stick with the Hebrew. Check yours. It'll say he went into the city. Now, I'm still trying to maintain people's trust in the Bible and even in the King James. I do trust the King James translators, highly. Again, part of me wishes I didn't have to show people any of these difficulties. I'm an inerrantist, and these are not all fun or easy to explain. But my hand is being forced. King James onlyists are insisting on letter-perfect accuracy in text and translation. They reject the New King James for failing to achieve this standard, even though I guarantee that if King James only leaders would allow it, their people would get great benefit from the easier English of the New King James, the contemporary English. But these leaders don't use just weights. I'll give one more minor example, one provided to me by my pastor friend, and kudos to him. I wish I could give his name. In Genesis 4:25, the King James says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth, for God said, She hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew." But the Hebrew doesn't say whom Cain slew. It says, because Cain killed him. Now, this presents a test for King James-only critics of the New King James. I think that it's possible to conclude here that the King James translators made a sufficiently accurate translation of the Hebrew, but one that was just slightly dynamic. However, it just so happens that the King James matches the Greek Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate perfectly here. They both say, whom Cain slew. If you insist that the King James is accurately translating the Hebrew here, even though it matches the Greek and Latin perfectly, then you have to allow the same measure of liberty to the New King James translators at places where their textual basis looks a little uncertain. I really could go on. I won't claim to have scored a touchdown yet or even gotten a first down. That's up to my hearers to determine. Did I persuade you that the standard King James only narrative is false? That King James onlyism uses unjust weights. It criticizes the New King James for faults, if you even wish to call them that the King James commits as well. Now, let me be clear. I do not believe I have pointed to any actual faults, genuine errors in the King James in this video. I think it's perfectly defensible to translate the Septuagint or the Vulgate when the Hebrew is terribly difficult. I think it's okay to translate Beelzebul with Beelzebub if, as I presume, that's what most people at the time said, even though most people were technically wrong. And there's no real difference in meaning between the child that is born to you and the child that will be born to you, when both are referring to an obviously future event. Mary clearly had not given birth yet. I'm perhaps less inclined to give the King James translators a pass on Revelation 16:5, but I feel I'd have to do a little more work to find out if we can recover any of their reasoning before I'd be willing to call what they did a direct error. Maybe I would conclude that that was an error. I'm not opposed to doing so, and neither were the King James translators. As I've quoted on this channel once or a million times before, the King James translators specifically deny in their preface that their work was perfect. I know it's unsettling to some very good Christian people to consider that their translations may not be perfect. What good is an imperfect translation of a perfect book? I get that. But the view that I'm putting forward is the view of the King James translators and of the vast, vast majority of faithful conservative Christians who can read Greek and Hebrew. If you cannot read those languages, or any other languages than English, perhaps you ought to humbly acknowledge that those people who can read the biblical languages are seeing something you don't see. King James onlyists, in my experience, tend to tell themselves one of two neat and tidy stories: a Masoretic text TR story or a Ruckmanite story. The MTTR story goes like this. Once upon a time, God inspired the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament, and he promised in Psalm 12 and Matthew 5 to preserve them perfectly, down to the jot and tittle. Satan came along and produced counterfeits of the Greek New Testament, but thankfully, the King James Version translators perfectly translated the perfect Hebrew and Greek texts once and for all, and it's easy to spot the terrible satanic corruptions in other Bibles. When difficulties and inconsistencies are pointed out, however, in this MTTR story, as I've done in this video, it tends to turn into the Ruckmanite story, which goes like this. Once upon a time, God gave special blessings to the King James translators so that all of their textual choices and all of their translation choices were perfect. If there are a few places in the King James that have no textual support in the Greek or Hebrew manuscripts, that's okay, because God inspired the King James translators to choose the right reading. If there are a few places in the King James Version where the translators actually follow readings taken from Erasmus that were translated from the Vulgate, that's okay, because God inspired the King James translators to recover the right reading. Now, I told the pastor who sent me some of these examples that I don't enjoy having to point out these difficulties and complexities. But let me build another bridge of trust, the one that I myself use all the time in my Bible study travels. Who gave us a situation in which we have incredibly well-preserved copies of the Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament, but there are numerous minor uncertainties and difficulties? Who gave us a world in which perfect translation between languages is impossible? Who inspired the New Testament apostles to quote a Greek translation of the Old Testament rather than make new and doubtless perfect translations of the Hebrew? And by the way, I draw that last question directly from the King James translators in their preface. Who chose not to give us inspired translators, yea, even a pope, to give the best translation in each language his official imprimatur, the seal of divine approval? Who gave us a Bible that comes in two very different languages, Hebrew and Greek, and actually Aramaic, 3, and would therefore require translation in the first place? Who gave us a Bible over the course of 1,500 years instead of all at once? Who chose to commit his precious word to fragile papyrus and sheepskin? Who gave us the excellent but not perfect situation we're in? But who told us that one day the perfect would come, that we would know even as also we are known? I think you know the answer to my not-so-rhetorical questions. God did all of these things, and he is good. He is my refuge, even when I don't understand his choices. The New King James Version is an excellent, though not perfect, translation of the Masoretic Hebrew text and Greek Textus Receptus into intelligible contemporary English. If it has minor flaws and difficulties, I don't deny it. I just deny that the King James is absolutely free of those things. The King James and the New King James are both excellent and trustworthy. But the New King James has one huge advantage over the King James, and this too is the fruit of a choice of God. The New King James translators all spoke the English that you and I speak. That's the touchdown when it comes to Bible translation, actually producing understanding in God's people. If you weigh the New King James against the King James justly, you will conclude the same thing.